Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 11 November 2024. It is the 540th birthday of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was born in Seville on this date in 1484. De las Casas was a younger contemporary of Machiavelli, the Florentine political philosopher, who was born about 15 years earlier, and an elder contemporary of Franciscus Patricius, the Croatian skeptic, was born 42 years later. The late medieval or early modern world that De las Casas was born into was a world that still largely retained its medieval appearance, but that was changing rapidly. In my episode on Petrarch climbing Mount Ventoux in 1336, I talked about how some have claimed that Petrarch was already a transitional figure to modernity at that time. While on the other hand, we can find remnants of the medieval world continued well into the modern world. The medieval and modern worlds overlapped for hundreds of years, and De las Casas lived during this overlap of the medieval and modern worlds. One of the most obvious signs of change was the age of discovery, when Columbus crossed the Atlantic, opening the New World to Europe. Vasco da Gama explored the coast of Africa, and Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the planet. The Spanish conquest of the New World was an unprecedented disruption in history. Two populations of humanity, of the old world and the new, the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere, which had not known of each other for more than 10,000 years, were brought together suddenly and often violently. William McNeill and Jared Diamond have focused on the epidemiological consequence of the convergence of old world and new world disease pool, which was catastrophic for the indigenous populations of the Americas, which didn't share the immunities that were gained by the shared disease pools of Africa, Asia, and Europe. But there were also profound moral consequences of this disruptive convergence of planetary history. And Bartolomé de las Casas was in the thick of it as an early Spanish settler of Hispaniola, arriving in 1502, only 10 years after the first voyage of Columbus. He became a Dominican friar after having first arrived in the New World and was a tireless advocate of the interests of the indigenous populations of Spanish conquests in the New World. He participated in the famous Valladolid debate of 1550 and 1551, which was an official inquiry sponsored by the Spanish crown to assess the moral status of the natives of the Americas. When the Spanish were creating their empire in the New World, the initial actions of the conquistadors were outright military conquest, but the consolidation of political control was legalistic and even, I think we can say, conscientious. The Spanish were significantly more conscious of the moral dimension of their expansion into the Americas than many of the other European peoples engaged in similar expansion. The problem, of course, is that our moral consciousness of the modern world is not their moral consciousness of the early modern world, which I earlier called an overlap of the medieval and modern world. So it's easy to pass over Spanish moral conscientiousness without recognizing it for what it was. A consequence of this moral conscientiousness was the formal debate that was held at Valladolid among the most advanced theologians of the age as to whether the natives of the Americas had souls and whether they should be enslaved or coerced into conversion. The papal bull Sublimus Dei of 1537 was issued to confirm that the natives were rational beings. The new laws of 1542 were issued to address the conditions of the encomienda system. We can criticize these efforts from our contemporary presuppositions. For example, today we might ask whether the better question than whether the indigenous peoples had souls and whether there was an obligation to convert them to Christianity would have been whether the Native Americans and their culture possessed intrinsic value, and whether there was some obligation to preserve the intrinsic value of their way of life. But questions like these belong to our present conceptual framework and couldn't even have been formulated within the conceptual framework of the 15th century. Nevertheless, while the distinctive modern concepts like intrinsic value hadn't yet been formulated, there were perennial moral concepts present in the 15th century, no less than in our time, to which people at the time responded. De las Casas was among those who adopted both specifically Christian concepts as well as perennial moral concepts in a scathing critique of Spanish actions in the New World. He wrote much, but he is best known for his short work, A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies, which was written in 1542 and published in 1552. The book was instrumental in bringing to light abuses of the Spanish settlers in the New World and the encomienda system in which indigenous peoples were forced to labor for Spanish masters on their estates. One could also say that De las Casas was instrumental in founding the Black legend of Spanish cruelty in the New World, a legend that was assiduously promoted by Protestants who were often no better in their treatment of indigenous peoples. The idea of a Black legend is a historical construction of some interest. The idea was introduced to explain some of the stories of atrocities of the Spanish and Spanish America, some of which atrocity stories were known to be fabrications by the Northern European Protestant powers engaged in the settlement of North America, who had an interest in demonstrating the unique cruelty and barbarity of Spanish rule in Spanish America. Constructing Black legends continues in our own day, with manufactured atrocities spread by social media. Mark Twain famously said that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. At the same time, there are authentic atrocities that do occur, and these appear incredible to those who aren't living through the events, and they become the object of skepticism precisely because of the false stories of atrocities that have been circulated previously. For the historian, this is a sticky wicket because you need to give full due to the suffering of those who have experienced authentic atrocities while not being so gullible as to fall for false atrocities spread for propagandistic reasons. Over the distance of hundreds of years, it can be enormously difficult to sort out what happened and what the appropriate context should be for the interpretation of these events. We've seen in our own time that even questioning the validity of a claimed atrocity can be taken as an affront, and this isn't an atmosphere in which dispassionate scholarship is going to be able to do its work. So the problems that De las Casas and others were trying to deal with weren't new then, and they're still with us now. There are no definitive answers to the moral dilemmas imposed on historians as a result of their narration of disputed and divisive events. Noted Latin American scholar Louis Hankey wrote a book on Las Casas' work as an historian, Bartolomé de las Casas, Historian, an essay in Spanish historiography, as well as another book on Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas, an interpretation of his life and writings. In the former book, Hankey recounts de las Casas' early interest in the New World. Quote, Las Casas was a youth of 18 when Columbus first set sail to the west, precisely the age to be thrilled by the freshness and the greatness of the enterprise. And he seems to have followed the unfolding of the drama with the ubiquitousness of a reporter. He was present in Seville when Columbus returned in triumph from his first voyage with 7 Indians, brightly beplumed parrots, Indian masks cleverly contrived from fish bones, and a large quantity of gold, including samples of finely wrought work. Las Casas also saw the ecclesiastical ornaments presented by Queen Isabella for the new churches in the Indies just before Columbus left on his second voyage. When this expedition returned to Seville, Las Casas was one of the let me start over. Las Casas was there then too and saw India, one of the 2 ships built in America by Columbus after storms had destroyed his Spanish vessels. And he also saw Columbus at that time dressed in a brown habit similar to that of a Franciscan, for he was very devout, unquote. Not only was de las Casas interested in the Americas early on, but he lived longer than most of the Spanish who traveled to the New World, and he brought the perspective of decades of experience to his historical writings. For all the admiration that Hanke expresses for de las Casas' work as an historian, Hanke called a brief account of the destruction of the Indies, quote, his propaganda tract, not really a history at all, unquote. In this book, de las Casas resembles Procopius, who was remembered not for his official histories, but for his scandalous secret history. But it was the brief account of the destruction of the Indies that has been most influential and most read of all the works of de las Casas. Indigenous peoples of the Caribbean are presented by de las Casas as natural Christians who require only minimal religious instruction to be brought within the fold of the church. Quote, the natives are tractable and capable of morality or goodness, very apt to receive the instilled principles of Catholic religion, nor are they averse to civility and good manners, being not so much decomposed by variety of obstructions as the rest of mankind. Inasmuch that having sucked it, if I may so express it myself, the very first rudiments of the Christian faith, they are so transported with zeal and fervor in the exercise of ecclesiastical sacraments and divine service that the very religiosos themselves stand in need of the greatest and most signal patience to undergo such extreme transports. And to conclude, I myself have heard the Spaniards themselves, who dare not assume the confidence to deny the good nature predominant in them, declare that there was nothing wanting in them for the acquisition of eternal beatitude, but the sole knowledge and understanding of the deity, unquote. The perspective of de las Casas, then, is not the intrinsic value of their way of life or any kind of implicit title to the lands they occupied, but their readiness to adopt Christianity, for which de las Casas believed they had a natural predisposition to accept. So when the papacy issued the bull Sublimus Dei of 1537, that native peoples were rational beings, and the Spanish had a religious obligation to win their souls for the church, de las Casas was in agreement with the hierarchy of the church and its official pronouncements. Where he disagreed with officialdom was with the means and methods of bringing rational beings into the church. That souls should be saved, he didn't question, and this was, in fact, the basis of his work. But how souls should be saved was the real problem for de las Casas. It was the Spanish for de las Casas who failed to measure up to their faith. De las Casas portrayed the predations on the native peoples by the Spaniards as being like wild animals. Quote, the Spaniards first assaulted the innocent sheep, so qualified by the Almighty, as is pre-mentioned, like most cruel tigers, wolves, and lions, hunger-starved, studying nothing for the space of 40 years after their first landing, but the massacre of these wretches, whom they have so inhumanely and barbarously butchered and harassed with several kinds of torments never before known or heard, of which you shall have some account in the following discourse. That of 3 millions of persons which lived in Hispaniola itself, there is at present but the inconsiderable remnant of scarce 300. Nay, the island of Cuba, which extends as far as Valladolid in Spain is distant from Rome, lies now uncultivated like a desert and entombed in its own ruins, unquote. He then concludes his tract implicitly contrasting the falseness of the Spanish to the innocent ingenuousness of the indigenous people. Quote, the Spaniards first set sail to America, not for the honor of God, or as persons moved and merited thereunto by servant zeal to the true faith, nor to promote the salvation of their neighbors, nor to serve the king, as they falsely boast and pretend to do, but in truth, only stimulated and goaded on by insatiable avarice and ambition, that they might forever domineer, command, and tyrannize over the West Indians, whose kingdoms they hoped to divide and distribute among themselves, which, to deal candidly, in no more or less intentionally than by all these indirect ways to disappoint and expel the kings of Castile out of these dominions and territories, that they themselves, having usurped the supreme and regal empire, might first challenge it as their right and then possess and enjoy it. Unquote. These themes of De las Casas are still with us today in discussions of human rights, indigenous rights, colonialism, paternalism, conversion, and historical objectivity. As I said earlier, they didn't start with De las Casas, and they are still with us today, if not in a sharpened and more vivid form. So happy birthday, Bartolomé de las Casas, and thanks for listening.